Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 109, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Dan Abrahams. Dan, thank you very much for coming on.
No problem, Ben. Really honoured and delighted to be joining you today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I'm great. It's great to have you on because obviously you're a sports psychologist. I'm sure a lot of people have seen your work or follow you online. And I'm sure a lot of people, you're a fellow podcast host as well, the Sports Psych Show, which I've listened to a good few episodes on there now. So I'm sure a lot of people have as well. But do you want to give us a little bit of background, mate? Just take us into some of the people you've worked with and some of the work you've done so far.
Well, thank you, mate, and it's good to meet my one podcast listener as well. I mean, awesome. That's it's good. I owe you a beer, basically, at some point. Look, a brief potted biography without boring everybody. I'm a former pro golfer, and I always have a little bit of fun around that by saying I failed miserably as a pro golfer, which I suppose to a degree I did in terms of trying to get to world number one, which I wanted to do. I think world number 20,000 was about the highest I got. So I then coached golf. I did all my coaching qualifications, coached the game, and as I was coaching the game, I'd always been really interested in the mental side of golf, which is quite an accessible sport for the mental side is quite accessible within golf. And so I got into it as a player, and then my interest furthered as a golf coach. And as I was coaching, I went to university, did a degree in psychology, a master's in sports psychology. And about 15 years ago, I kind of came to a bit of a crossroads and was like, well, am I going to carry on being a golf coach and have the qualifications on the side, or am I going to be a full-time sports psychologist? So I chose the latter. And for the last 15 years, I've worked across all sports. I've worked, I suppose, predominantly in football and golf, because obviously I know golf like the back of my hand. I was lead psychologist for England golf between 2013 and 16. I was lead psychologist for England rugby, working with Eddie Jones and his staff between 2017 and 2018. And in terms of football, I've worked with a number of Premier League clubs over the years. Fulham, Crystal Palace, West Ham, Derby County, FC Bournemouth. There's others that I can't think of, and some I've had confidentiality agreements with, and worked with a number of players globally. I've written 4 books, 3 of them football, soccer, and 1 of them golf. I run my own sports psychology podcast, and I'm a bit of a shameless marketer on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and that jazz. So if anybody's read my work, it's because I put myself out there a bit, and that's me.
Awesome. I could be selfish and take a big chunk of the podcast and start getting some golf tips because I'm in desperate need. But I'll say
golf
that
tips
for
from me.
Time.
You don't want golf. Trust me, you don't want golf tips from me. I can assure you.
You need them from anyone right now, Dan. But let's dive in, mate, because I think it'd be great to get your perspective on a few different areas, and especially obviously a lot of our listeners are sports scientists, strength and conditioning coaches, working at anything from sort of academy or amateur, semi-professional, right up to first team level. Yeah. So I was going to ask you to start with, so some of the high performers or the top athletes that you've worked with or top players, what are some common traits you see amongst them?
Hey, that's a really interesting question. And I suppose traditional motivational guru type psychology would condense it into sort of unitary traits. I'm a little bit more into, I think absolutely we can look at various characteristics, and it's likely that high achievers in inverted commas, would orientate themselves to particular types of traits like disciplined and focused and confident and competitive and all those kind of things. I'm not saying that they're not important, but I think almost like my first piece of advice today, or the first thing to potentially consider, is traits, characteristics are quite complex. And for every characteristic a footballer, a sports competitor has, if you call it a character trait that's a strength, it can also be a hindrance. It can also be a weakness. So for every sports competitor or footballer that says, well, I'm really, really, really competitive, and they'd probably put their number one on competitive, actually, sometimes that competitiveness gets in the way. And that's worth noting. For every competitor that says, I'm confident, sometimes perhaps they're overly confident, and sometimes maybe they need to, for example, engage in critical thinking about their game. Perhaps sometimes they're a bit too confident and they don't explore weaknesses or things that they need to improve. Perhaps you might get a competitor who says, oh, I'm persistent, I'm really persistent, but sometimes persistence isn't useful. And actually, we're better off stopping on a certain path and going down seeking alternatives or going down another path. So perhaps this is a slightly different way to answer your question. And I apologize if I've thrown you a slight curveball, but I think that if we look at personality theory, and obviously the leading personality theory is the 5-factor theory. So what we pretty much know now, knowing is a strong word here in psychology, but what we could pretty much safely and strongly hypothesize is that the top 5 traits human beings have on continuums is openness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and extroversion, introversion. And what we know is that what we could probably safely say is that champions are champions because they're quite, say, high conscientious. You know, they're quite orderly, they're very industrious, they tend to be quite industrious. It's very difficult to be a champion if you're not industrious, if you haven't got a work ethic, if you're not hardworking, if you're not high conscientious. But quite often what you find as a psychologist is actually you're trying to quite often help a player turn down their volume of conscientiousness. You're trying to actually help them manage their work ethic. You're trying to help them quite often come away from their sport and actually try to help them have multiple identities rather than this single identity of I'm a golfer, you know, I'm Dan, I'm a golfer, I'm John, I'm a footballer, etc. So you're actually trying to turn down the volume of conscientiousness. Maybe sometimes you're trying to turn up the volume of neuroticism, so a negative emotion. So maybe you're trying to help them be a bit more critical thinking. So hopefully I'm not confusing everybody, but it's really not as simple as saying, well, here are these traits, here are these characteristics, and we must slot everybody into these characteristics. I would always say to sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches, I mean, I think strength and conditioning coaches and sports scientists are in a wonderful position to be. They are psychologists anyway. You do psychology within your role, right? So to be, in my humble opinion, to be better at delivering on psychology, it's not saying you must have these characteristics. It's actually having conversations around maybe what characteristics does somebody have, and what about these characteristics help them, and what about these characteristics hinder them, and starting to have better conversations around what helps and what hinders them, and how you're going to help them manage those traits, those characteristics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. No, definitely. And that relates really nicely to a coach as well, doesn't it? Like we're talking there about players, but if we relate it to coaches, like we said, sports scientists, S&C coaches, like everything that you just said just relates perfectly to a coach as well, being critical about their practice or their performance. Like it's all relatable, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And, you know, as you're speaking now, I'm thinking of strength and conditioning coaches, and I'm certainly thinking of sports scientists and how, I mean, certainly in the world of sports science, a lot of the work is data driven. And a lot of sports scientists, as a consequence, because of their education and because of perhaps the characteristics that lent them towards the kind of education that sports science gives you. A lot of sports scientists love numbers, they love boxes, they love neat things, and they don't necessarily love chaos And they don't necessarily they love quantitative stuff, that not necessarily qualitative stuff. And again, that actually falls in that personality trait of conscientiousness. We love it's conscientiousness is actually split into two: industriousness and orderliness. And what I've found in the past, especially with sports scientists, is that they tend to be quite orderly. Again, numbers, drills, neatness. What does this number say about somebody? And they love boxing people, or putting people into boxes, by and large. And I don't want to categorize everybody, so please excuse me. Hopefully, I'm not offending anybody. But I don't mean for this to be an offense, because it's not an offense, because that's who they are and how they are. And actually, that's where they're very, very helpful. Is actually they can help football coaches, for example, understand data a lot better. They can help football coaches be a lot more orderly when it comes to this stuff. It's just recognizing that there's a time to come away from that orderliness. There's a time to come away from the neatness in the box, and think a little bit more about the holistic side of a human being, and perhaps the complex nature of human beings and the things that underpin behavior, rather than looking at the behavior in the data itself. So it's just understanding who we are and how that impacts how we go about our day-to-day things in the gym and on the pitch as S&Cs, as sports scientists, and how that can hinder us, how it influences our communication, how it influences our relationships, how it influences what we do and how we go about what we do, and just try to be a little bit more flexible along that continuum. Perhaps turn down the volume of that conscientiousness at times. That's a very, very brief generic introduction to that. So I would always suggest that S&Cs and sports scientists just delve a little bit into personality science. That can be useful.
Awesome. And we've talked loads about two areas you just mentioned then: communication and building relationships. And they're absolutely huge when you work with any athlete, aren't they? But football definitely is another one of those scenarios where it's so important, because we're dealing with humans, aren't we? We're dealing with humans that play football.
Look, absolutely, and that's where maybe what I could offer here is sometimes to wear your expertise lightly in the gym or on the pitch. I think that us in the world, whether it's in sports psychology, sports science, S&C, is we have a lot of knowledge. We've done our degrees, we've done our postgrads, we've been supervised, we've spent a lot of money on courses, we've spent a lot of time reading our books, studying our material. We have a lot of information up there. And sometimes we've got to be a little bit careful with that. Sometimes we've got to take a step back when we've got, let's say, a player in front of us, perhaps a player who's being a little bit resistant, perhaps a player who, at the end of the day, this player sees the world through their eyes and perhaps is pushing back a little bit. And we have a great saying in sports psychology, or psychology in general: insistence can lead to resistance. And so relationships are often built rather than, I have a lot of expertise, I'm going to give you this expertise. Come on, you've got to trust me. I've got all this education. Sometimes it's useful to see the player as the expert. The player's him. We've got to be a little bit more player-centered than coach-driven on occasion. I'm not saying player-driven, I'm saying player-centered. So sometimes it's important for us to take a step back. If we want to build relationships, it's empathizing with the player's point of view. It's asking open-ended questions. Another term for that is divergent questions. Just exploring a little bit about how that player sees the world, why they see it that way, how they like to go about certain things. Just probing a little bit, and then maybe even allowing them to do that, or just saying, okay, go ahead and do that. Do you mind if I observe? Do you mind if I monitor that? And then from that observation and monitoring, it might give you an opportunity to make some suggestions, not necessarily just to tell somebody what to do, but just make some suggestions, make some choice. There's some great work here from a researcher called Rebecca Luthwaite. And she talks about the power of giving athletes choice. Rather than this is what you must do, it can be, well, have you tried A? Or perhaps an alternative option is to try B. Perhaps an alternative way to go about things in the gym, an alternative, and I'm not an expert in the gym, as you'll discover from my language, but perhaps an alternative way to do it is option B. You've got option A and option B. What might suit you there? So you're giving an athlete a little bit of autonomy there. Choice is really important. So let's think about some of these things here. Empathy. Okay. I see that. I understand why you're going about things like that. Okay, I get that. Open-ended questions. Try to understand their world. Making suggestions, or sorry, excuse me, monitoring. Just being involved, and being curious when you're involved, and tapping into an athlete or a player's curiosity by perhaps providing questions. Sorry, I beg your pardon, providing suggestions, option A, option B. I think sometimes that's a great way to establish relationships rather than just diving in saying, I've got all this knowledge in my head, here's some ideas. And in your world, it's like, this just makes complete sense. This is logical. But we've got to remember that's not probably the logical side of the brain. That frontal cortex probably isn't the side of the brain that we want to necessarily communicate with. We've got to recognize that perhaps the athlete in front of us is wired up in a different way based on their experiences, based on previous coaching advice, based on how they see the world, based on their personality, taking that into consideration and just starting a negotiation. I love this. I've started more and more. I've started to use the word negotiation. I think coaching, whether you're a psychological coach or an S&C coach or a sports science coach or an actual football coach, I think negotiation is so important rather than just instruction. I'm the boss. And don't get me wrong, there's a time for that authoritarian approach. There's a time for that, but maybe it's a bit more about a negotiation, about a co-creation. It's about appreciating the player's worldview, values, personality, previous experiences, thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc., and coming on board with them rather than them coming on board with you.
I love that. I think that's great. And a couple of things that jump out to me was where you talked about I think you used the phrase insistence can lead to resistance. And so many coaches, and I think sometimes coaches have to do this a little bit to go into a program. Like you said, you made me laugh when you said it, is that we have like a program drawn up, right? I've got it. This is the answer. This is how I'm going to create footballers, and we'll try and put it into place, and then we'll hit loads of resistance. And I think coaches have to do that because they have to learn from doing that as well. And then the negotiation, I think, is another great point because, like you said, we don't want to make it player-led because then the player has all the power. But at the same time, I was trying to think of like real-life situations where we might work with players, then they might move on to a different club. Now, if we can empower them with, actually, this is how you're best off preparing, try, like you said, try this exercise over this exercise, whatever it is, we can be so impactful with those players, can't we?
Well, I think what you're doing, you're not only giving them choice, but you're empowering them with the capacity to critically think. And quite often players are scared of that. And this is why some players will always push back and go, well, just tell me what to do.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting, how would you not tug of war, but this is where I think as a coach, you've got to be quite nimble. And again, when I say coach, I'm saying S&C coach, sports scientist coach. I think you've got to be quite nimble between, if there's a continuum, if I can ask people listening in to consider a continuum from being player driven to player centered to coach driven, I think you can go up and down that line. I'm not a big fan of I must be coach driven, I must be player centered, I must be player driven. It's like, let's go up and down that line. And as you said at the beginning of your career, you might be more towards the coach driven because you just don't have the knowledge. You just don't have all those experiences and times knowledge to be able to give you a capacity to deal with the context in a given moment in a very robust manner. And as you go on in your career and you acquire more knowledge and you acquire more experience, you learn to be much more robust because you've seen more situations, you've seen more contexts, you've experienced more individual challenges, you've been pushed back, you've been shouted at, you've been told to F off, you've been included, incorporated, you've been successful, you've failed miserably, and you've had all these experiences and you've acquired these knowledge on all these courses. And so suddenly your mind is quite nimble now, and you can go over here and you can go over there and you can go up there and you can go down there and you can go to player driven, you can go to coach driven, and you can go to player centered, and you've perhaps done a few psych things, read a few psych books, and you've learned about empathy and compassion, and you've learned about open-ended questions and all this stuff, and choice and all these things, and that's where you can be quite robust. So I've kind of lost my train of thought in terms of what you said towards the end. You had some rich things, so sorry about that. But I think you're definitely going to start your career being quite coach driven, and then you can start to be quite nimble. I think, and that's it. You said about players come to you with history. And that's a classic, really, really big thing going on in our industry at the moment is the incorporation of psychologically informed environments. We're trying to incorporate psychologically informed environments. Think about this: PIE. P for psychologically, I for informed, E for environments. And I think you can have a PIE, PIE, a PIE in a gym. You can have a PIE within your sports science department. And what a PIE is, again, coming back to this notion of a PIE appreciates individual difference. It appreciates that players have history. They would have had past S&C experiences, past sports science experiences. They have thoughts, they have feelings, they have differing personalities. And you've got to be nimble enough to be able to do that. And that does happen over time. So hopefully that puts a bit more meat on the bone there.
Definitely. And that comes down to, again, something we spoke about a lot is managing the individual within the team environment, doesn't it? Like we've got however many individuals, 20, 30 individuals, but we're dealing with a team. And that's where that's so important, isn't it?
Which is brutally hard. I mean, let me give you some experiences I've had when I've worked in medical departments who have coexisted, obviously, with S&C and sports science. I mean, it strikes me, and you can come back and tell me if I'm wrong, it strikes me that all footballers seem to dislike prehab. Right, so would that be the right term where they're doing some, or where they're kind of warming up in a gym area before they go training? Yeah. That seems to be something that a lot of players hate, and I understand that it really annoys or frustrates physios, let's say, and S&Cs, because it's like, this is important. This is an injury prevention, and I think there's lots of different directions we can go. And I can think of a medical department I worked in recently, and the head of medical was very much interested in investing in education, upskilling players, educating players to understand, why this is important. I'd probably add to that, in terms of empathy and in terms of open-ended questioning, is just going, okay, I understand why you might consider this to be a frustration, an annoyance. You come in, you're having breakfast, you're chatting with your mates, you want to go out there and you want to kick a ball around, you want to learn, going into the gym, doing your prehab stuff feels a little bit distant from playing the game. This all feels a bit new, or whatever it feels like. I get that. Tell me why you dislike it. Tell me what it is you're not so sure about. Tell me what isn't quite connecting here with you, and just genuinely being curious, listening, and then striving to take them down a path of negotiation. Where is there a point of give and take here? If there's not, there's not. If the team have to do it, they have to do it. But is there a point of negotiation? Where is the misunderstanding? What is it that they're seeing in their world that's not quite connecting up? So for me, it's having the capacity as a physio, an S&C, and a sports scientist to empathize, to ask those questions, to get information from the player, and then slowly chip away at helping them understand why this might be important, and why there might be better ways of doing this. and what that looks like, and then supporting them in that process. So I think that's really important.
I definitely agree. I think it's really fascinating, actually, some of the stuff we've already spoke about, because I was thinking at the start of the episode, like, if we turn around to a lot of sports scientists and S&C coaches and said, like, what's your psychological program with players or your approach with players, they might not be able to answer that question. But then going into some of the stuff you've already spoke about and the conversations and the sort of negotiation and things like that, a lot of coaches will be doing something like that already, won't they? So psychology in our roles, and you mentioned it at the start, like it's key, isn't it? And whether we know it or not, we're working psychologically with players as well as physically.
Look, yes, 100%, and so this could take us off into an down an interesting path, because everything we're talking about, I mean, number one, first and foremost, there's people skills, and there's definitely S&Cs and sports scientists who are just good at this anyway, because they're good people and they're good at communication. And it might be that a psychologist can add a little bit of value by introducing an S&C and a sports scientist or any kind of coach to a framework. So the empathy and the open-ended questions and reflection and suggestion, these are very much a part of solution-focused brief therapy, or very much a part of motivational interviewing. And actually, on the basis of solution-focused brief therapy, I might start introducing coaches to something like scaling. And if an athlete says, I don't feel like coming, I'm not feeling confident right now, I think quite often what happens there is, even with a football coach, but certainly with a physio, an S&C and a sports scientist, then they don't always have the tools to be able to deal with that conversation. And a tool like scaling from SFBT, solution focused brief therapy, can be really useful there. So what scaling is, okay, right, I hear you're not very confident right now. Okay, I get that. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being as confident as you can possibly be, 1 being not confident at all, where are you right now? Where are you right now? And that footballer might be standing in front of you and they might say, well, not very good at the moment. Yeah, down at a 4. And part of scaling is to help somebody reframe the situation. So you might then respond by going, okay, 4, why as high as 4? Why not 3 or 2? What's been going on that's been going quite well that's enabled you to be at 4? So suddenly you can reframe that, and the player might go, well, I had a half decent game the other day and it was all right. And I had an assist, but the rest was rubbish. But I did have that. Oh yeah, I saw that assist. That was really good. And I did think you had some good moments there. So you're just trying to edge them towards seeing 4 as actually not as half decent. And then you can start to explore, what does 5 look like? What does 6 look like? How can I help you nudge up to 5 and 6? What can I do to be a part of this? Could we go to the coaching staff, or one person, a trusted person in the coaching staff, and start to consider what we can do to nudge you up to 5 and 6? So you can get a real community feel there, a real integrated approach between yourself, the athlete, and the coaching staff. When you use something like scaling, I'm using it all the time, and that's something you can use in the gym. That's something you can just use with a casual conversation coming off the pitch with a player who looks a bit down. Scaling. So we're bringing in all these neat little psychological tools into our everyday S&C role, into our everyday sports science role. I think that's so important. That's why it's important to, whether it's reading some of these books around this area, or whether it's having a sports psych on site, if you're lucky to have a sports psych on site. But another thing to say here, Ben, is, the one thing I would add, and for all those, S&Cs and sports scientists working at clubs, this is where I'm now going to get a bit vociferous. This is where I'm now going to strong arm you a little bit here. Something I've worked for 15 years in the football industry. And this is a football-based podcast, isn't it?
It is.
Yes, thank you. I do so many, Ben, that I sometimes forget which ones I'm on. So I do apologize. Very embarrassing moment for me. So yeah, so I'll lean towards the football here. But, I say this, it could be in basketball, it could be in golf, it could be in tennis, it could be in rugby, for instance, and I've experienced a lack of this in rugby. absolutely, I'm going to be very strong here, so please excuse me. It absolutely perplexes me that more footballers don't have a mental framework to the mental side of their game. It absolutely defeats me that when I sit down with players, and I'm very honored to be able to sit down with some of the finest players in the world, some very good Premier League players, some very good players globally. And I don't say that to impress somebody. I say this to impress upon people listening in. I sit down with very good players, and never, ever, ever, ever is a player able to articulate what they're trying to achieve mentally on the pitch. Ever. Now, and to me, that's not good enough. Now, I understand that there are some players who have so much skill in their feet that they can get away with it more often than not, but not all the time. I understand that there are some players who have a capacity towards mental skill, irrespective of not having that framework. I understand that. Fine. But they're not great all the time. I don't get it. And somebody needs to help me get it. And nobody has so far in any conversation I have. I don't get how a player at, let's say, the Premier League, the Championship, at any level, where it's an adult elite level and developing elite level, where they're taking this seriously, can't articulate what they're trying to achieve mentally on the pitch. That to me is unacceptable. And yet I sit down with player and tumbleweed floats across the floor. It is dead silence. What are you trying to achieve mentally? They can't tell me. And that is just simply unacceptable. Because if we're in the business of competitiveness, we're in the business of high performance under pressure, consistent high performance under pressure, we need to be better. Because what you can damn well guarantee is that whilst football works in seconds, the brain and the nervous system works in milliseconds. It trumps football for speed every single time. And I can guarantee you that we are designed as human beings, and we know this from evolutionary psychology, we know this from developmental psychology, we know this from personality psychology. So if you're an S&C coach, if you're a sports scientist working at a football club and you're watching your players play there on a Saturday, and you're watching them play, I guarantee you their brain and nervous system is working millisecond, scanning for threats, throwing out thoughts and feelings all the time, judging what's going on around them, and they need to have the capacity to deal with that. And what we also know, what we can also pretty safely say, is our brain and our nervous system tends towards the negative. It loves to bookmark failure. Okay, so quite often we tend towards a threat response rather than a challenge response on game day. And we need to be able to help players have a challenge response. We need to be able to help them compete with confidence, with a positive intent. Every single action executed on the front foot rather than the back foot, with freedom rather than with fear, to win rather than not to lose, executed with confidence. We need to be able to help players to pay attention on the pitch, to deal with distractions quickly, because so many goals go in against us because of being distracted. And then subsequently, because of that distraction, we find ourselves out of position, making slower decisions, a lack of awareness, seeing the runners, tracking runners, knowing where our teammates are, a failure to close down the space, to anticipate quickly. And that's all to do with attention. It's also to do with intensity, where we drop down in intensity because of flatness, because of lethargy. How many players say to me, Dan, I just wasn't feeling it today in the warm-up. I just wasn't feeling it today in the warm-up. I just wasn't there. Well, not good enough. Not good enough. What? And as a club, we can't help players with that. As a club, we don't have players who have a mental framework to help them deal with that. We're going to accept that. Not acceptable. And then it could be the other way around, where we have players who come out of their intent, they become too intense, overly aroused, anxious, frustrated, angry. Those kind of emotions that deal with that lend to an over arousal, where they don't deal with that in the moment. Intensity, attention, intent, positive intent, those three things, and having the capacity to get into your optimal mindset. This has to happen. So there's that. every single player needs a mental framework, in my opinion, and then we need psychologically informed environments that help our players express vulnerability and give them the capacity, the psychological safety to express vulnerability and share those mental frameworks. It belies belief. I told you I was going to be strong here. It belies belief. It belies belief that we're still in an era of man up. It belies belief, and I know that doesn't happen everywhere. It belies belief that players aren't given the psychological safety, the space to express vulnerability somewhere, with someone, with some people, in some capacity, whether that's in bigger groups or in small groups. And then it belies belief that if we don't have these mental frameworks anyway, but if we did, we need to share those. We need to share those. And those need to be shared. And then they need to be taken out onto the pitch and delivered in our small-sided game, our keep balls, our rondos, our 11v11s, our 7v7s, our passing with progression drills. We need to be sharing those. This rondo needs to be based around everybody, sharing their mental frameworks, helping each other. We need to have better conversations there. Coaches need to be helping each other. S&Cs need to be helping. You want players walking in, sharing their mental frameworks with S&Cs into the gym, and that's part of their sets. That's part of their activities in the gym. We need sports scientists having better knowledge about those mental frameworks, because those mental frameworks underpin or influence is the word I'm looking for there, the data that's coming back. So mental frameworks, individually, shared, space for vulnerability, absolutely crucial. Sorry, I went off on one there.
No, that was great. And it ties into something I was going to ask. And to give a little bit of context on this, a previous guest, and I referenced this in a recent episode, Gary Kineen, mentioned about sports scientists, S&C coaches having the first contact with players a lot of the time. So if it's a training session, a lot of the time they'll go out with S&C sports scientists first and do the warm-up, and it might be the same on a game day as well. So in terms of setting the tone of a session and getting players in the right mindset and in avoiding any complacency and setting the wrong tone, what do we need to be wary of in that situation?
I think it's a really good question. And I think the very first thing to say, if we were to strip things back, I know Gary's a good mate of mine, and he's absolutely spot on. And I think that S&Cs and sports scientists need to demand from themselves, and coaches need to demand of S&Cs and sports scientists the capacity to set the tone. So it's how do we set the tone? And if we're talking about setting the tone, let's operationalize that in terms of mental skills. That, I suppose, is the intensity. So it's turning up the volume of intensity. It's giving players the opportunity to execute with a positive intent, and it's helping them turn up the volume of attention. Okay, and to deal with distraction. But I think I come back to intensity is really, really important here. And S&C coaches and sports scientists can do this clearly via their voice, which they do anyway, but it's having a knowledge of those frameworks that's important. So let me give you, I think one of the challenges with this question is it's difficult to answer without having specific mental skills in on the act here. And I would always say, when I work with players and I work with departments, and this is where the sharing comes in, I think that players need a couple of keywords, action-based words, adjectives, essentially. Adjectives are really important: alert, alive, lively, relentless, dominant, strong, upbeat, athletic, sharp, belief, confidence, etc. All these words can be used as an adjective, a description of the noun. Okay, so noun could be to move. How do you want to move? I want to move sharp and lively. I want to move sharp and alert. When I work with players, I tend to help them create a couple of action-based words that they can say to themselves when they're warming up, So if a player has sharp and alert, come on, I'm going to warm up sharp and alert here, sharp and alert. And a coach next to the pitch can say, I want to see sharp and alert, want to see sharp and alert. Come on, Johnny, I want to see sharp and alert. Come on, Mary, I want to see sharp and alert here. You know, you said sharp and alert. You've asked me to remind you, come on, show me sharp and alert. So you can help that player set the tone. Now, the players themselves have to come up with those words. And it's important to remind them of those words. Come on, I want to see this warm up in the style of these words here. I want to see sharp and alert. That's really, really important. In that way, you're individualizing it. In that way, you're individualizing it. You know, and I think another thing there is where we need to be very, very mindful of, I, as coach by the side of the pitch, drive players through a loud voice, energized voice. Come on, work, work, work. Come on, come on. The problem with that is I'm replacing their self-talk. I'm doing the energy for them. It's a very interesting dynamic. I know we can't do this all the time, but when I've had conversations with sports scientists who will warm players up, I've said, I've often explored this idea. Have you ever thought of negotiating with players around coaches and sports scientists turning down the volume of their voice so that the players themselves can turn up the volume of their self-talk and up the volume of their own communication? Because I always see the S&C and the sports scientists and the coaches, the football coaches, doing the work for the player in terms of self-talk, in terms of interpersonal communication. So I think you can experiment. You wouldn't do it every day, but you can turn down the volume of that. And that's where you can take the key words and you can get the players reminding each other of their key words. Come on, John, I want you to be alert and alive. Come on, you like to be athletic. Show me athletic. Show me athletic. Why would it could be the coach doing that, but it could be your teammates doing that. And that comes back to your shared mental model. So I completely agree with Gary. How that's done is a little bit more intricate than simply the coach standing by the side of the pitch and driving the players. You can do that, and that's what is done so far. I'm going to make a bold statement here: not good enough. Not good enough. There needs to be, you need to help players have the capacity to be mentally skillful. And when you drive them, you're taking away their ability to be mentally skillful using their self-talk, using things like adjectives as key words. A final thing to say here, a final way, is to drive through body language. As old as time itself in sport, I understand that. But increasingly, there's more and more evidence coming out about this notion of embodied cognition. Embodied cognition, mental process, the embodiment of mental process, embodied cognition. More and more evidence that our mental processes are experienced through our bodies. And as much as our brain, our mind affects our body, so our body affects our mind. So insisting on great body language is really important. I think you can do that as well. That's really important. And the work of Amy Cuddy, that with her power posing, that for a few years was chastised, how you hold yourself increases, you hold yourself in a good posture. That potentially increases your volume of testosterone through your body, okay? And that potentially increases your capacity to perform, possibly. That's been chastised for a few years, but in the last couple of years, she's pushed back and found more evidence related to that effect. So I think great body language influences testosterone and feelings of power, and subsequently potentially better performance. So I think body language can matter. So in summary, body language, maybe turning down the volume of your communication so you turn up the volume of of self-talk and the communication between players, and having little mental skills like keywords, adjective, adjectives as action-based words that players can draw upon and drive and use to drive themselves, use to drive great little pictures in their head that influence behavior. Those are the kind of things I would say.
I think that's so relatable for coaches, because we've all fallen into the trap of, and I'll relate it to the warm-up again, of doing a warm-up and verbally just, well, not stopping, just constantly speaking and just filling the silence, haven't we? Just talking for the sake of talking. And like you say, not repeating any sort of adjectives, just using all sorts of different ones. So I think that's a great point. That really makes sense to me, is that you have a couple that you drill home, but you don't overcoach as well, because you need players to mentally get ready themselves, don't you? Because all they're going to do is go out onto the pitch, and then they're essentially by themselves to a certain degree.
Well, I'd say, Ben, what would be useful. I try to avoid shoulds and needs, but what would be useful is if you help the player come up with their own adjectives, because that's meaningful to them. And the one way to do that is to ask them about them at their best. Yeah. You're playing at your best. What does that look like? What does that feel like? What are you experiencing? What do others see? Provide a few adjectives that can then help them consider themselves at their best from an adjective point of view. Again, I'm going to come back here with sharp, alert, alive, lively, relentless, dominant, cool, calm, relaxed, focused. Everyone's different. So the problem with having your own adjectives, your own action-based words as a coach, is that you're just giving them what you think would be good. Whereas for some, Virgil van Dijk is going to be different from, let's say, a John Terry. I know John Terry's retired now, but I'm trying to think of two opposite players there. I'm sure there's better examples that people would be screaming at the screen now, listening to me. But, Virgil van Dijk, I've got a player I work with who has what I call a game face, which is kind of what we're talking about. Cool, calm Van Dijk. Cool, calm Van Dijk. I've got another player who plays, but so this plays in the Premier League. I've got another player I'm working with who has a game face of positive energy Terry. Energy Terry. And those guys just work differently. That maybe their nervous system works differently. Maybe they see the world differently. Maybe personality characteristics are different. Maybe their schematic of how to compete is different. How they experience the world through their body is different. So if you're there at the side of the pitch screaming, "Come on, sharp, come on, work," and you've got cool, calm Van Dijk there, you've got to recognize, I know I'm bringing complexity in here, but that might not be useful for cool, calm Van Dijk. And so we're almost venturing into motivational aspects here, and how people motivate themselves, in unique and individual specific ways.
Brilliant. I think that's top. And I wanted to switch gears a little bit. I wanted to touch on something you mentioned a little bit ago, which was failure. And I don't mean to finish on a negative at all, but I wanted to get your input on this, because in terms of failure, I'm thinking, well, a number of different scenarios. From a coach point of view, a lot of people that I've spoke to have talked about failure, whether that be trying things with players and it not working out the way they wanted, or being in jobs and losing jobs and seeing that as failure, that they end up getting sacked and being unemployed. And I wanted to just get your opinion on like mindset and some things that we could work on. So if we hit a point of losing a job, like what sort of things do we need to be wary of in terms of going again and seeking new opportunities?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say there, and I'd like, maybe this might be value add for somebody, because I think there's a lot of, there'll be a lot of things that people say to that question, or they'll answer it in a manner that is answered in a particular in a traditional style of failure is great and growth from failure, etc., etc. And all that is true. But the first thing I'd say as a psychologist is give yourself permission to be damn pissed off. Give yourself permission to mourn, essentially. And I know mourning sounds like quite a strong term, but my understanding is that there's good evidence to suggest that our anxiety pathways in our nervous system are strongly linked with our pain pathways, or I beg your pardon, our rejection pathways, being socially rejected, because ultimately being sacked is being, or let go is or failing at something, even as minute as just a bad session and a player having a dig at you, is social rejection, essentially. And the pathways related to social rejection, my understanding is that they relate to pain, and it hurts. And in my opinion, what we don't necessarily want to do is suppress that pain. So give yourself space. It's okay to feel down, despondent. It's okay to feel flat as a consequence of rejection. That's okay. How long somebody feels that way, might be individually specific. It might be contextual. I've been let go of positions, and as a point of vulnerability here, I lost one position a few years ago, and I still have some sleepless nights, and I still have some. When I say sleepless nights, I'm still tossing and turning and thinking of, wow, I can't believe that happened, and I felt I was unfairly treated there, and I sort of understand what happened there, and I didn't quite do it right there. And so we're human beings. And there will be some people who go, no, Dan, you're talking rubbish, just move on straight away. And that's fine. That's their prerogative to think like that or be like that. That's fine. But I don't think one should castigate any other way. I would say with that, as part of the healing process, mind your language. Mind your language. Mind your thinking. How am I thinking about this? As part of the healing process, am I catastrophizing? This is a disaster. This is the end of the world. This was absolutely outrageous, and this was, mind your language, mind extreme language or black and white thinking. And if I was to practice what I preach, anything that I've lost or I've failed, what I'm striving to do, and do I do it brilliantly all the time? Absolutely not. What I'm striving to do is see the other person's viewpoint, or the organization's viewpoint, or the team's viewpoint, or the manager or the coach's viewpoint. So as part of turning down the volume of pain, I'm perhaps trying to see the 360. I'm minding my language. I'm trying to see the 360-degree view. And of course, that classic of learning from it, I'm as part of seeing the 360-degree view, I'm looking at what went wrong and what was my part in that, what went right and what can I build from. I'm trying to get feedback if I can, where I can, and that's not always possible, I know. And sometimes you don't get the truth from people. And then ultimately it is time to move forward and look for the next opportunity. And for me there again, I think it's wrapped up in language, sitting down with a pen and a bit of paper, what next, and starting to brainstorm what next looks like, based on what you've learned, based on what you've experienced, based on where you'd like to go next. I think all those things are thrown in together, and you might take some notes, or you might just think it through and move on to the next thing. If we're talking about losing a position, if we're just talking about a little bit of failure as a consequence of bad feedback, again, you might do something similar. But I suppose the last thing to say here is this is where, if we can go up and down that line of player-led, player-centered, coach-driven, coach-led, if we go up and down and we've got more of a negotiation, more of a co-creation, and the player's more involved, then it becomes much more difficult for the player to say, well, this is disgraceful, this is awful, this doesn't work for me, because that player is part of that process. So then it's a conversation, a robust conversation around, okay, well, you were part of the process here, so can we talk a little bit about what you've experienced there, and what I'm doing that's not leading you, helping you have that optimal experience. It's just seeking to understand quite a lot of the time, and then seeking to find ways to move forward.
Brilliant. I could keep going on this stuff all day, but I really appreciate your time, Dan, and thank you very much for coming on the podcast. If people want to follow your work, I'm sure a lot are already, including the podcast, but where's the best place? Where would you direct them?
Website is danabrahams.com, danabrahams.com. And I'm always interested in engaging in people and talking and looking for, for new opportunities and consultancy positions. I can be emailed at dan@danabrahams.com. I'll throw you a plethora of social media accounts. The football one, I'll give you the football one for Twitter, is at danabrahams77. And at Sports Psych Show is the Sports Psych Show podcast, and obviously just Google Sports Psych Show to find that. At Dan Abrahams Soccer on Facebook, my Facebook page. You can find me on LinkedIn, Dan Abrahams. I'm posting a little article each day on LinkedIn and Facebook, and at Dan Abrahams Sport for Instagram. I think that's it. I think that's me.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you giving up your time, Dan. That's been brilliant, and I hope all the listeners have took plenty from it, as I have. But thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, sir. Enjoyed it. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks a lot.